This primer video will introduce you to some key Flowgear concepts ahead of our certification training course. The certification course contains a large number of practical exercises that we'll be moving together through as a class. So by going through this video first, you're getting an introduction to those concepts so that you're able to keep pace when we get to the real exercises. So if you haven't already done so, go and create a Flowgear account at flowgear.net. Click the link in the activation email, sign in at my.flowgear.net, and you'll get the workflow landing screen just like this. Then watch this video and go through and in parallel with me run through the exercises that I'm doing on screen. So this is the workflow landing screen, and the first thing that we're going to do is create a new workflow, which you can do by clicking the plus button at the top of the screen. So I'll click that, and then I will give a name to my workflow, and I'm just going to call mine example. Now this is the design canvas where we are able to lay out the steps in the integration process that we're building. I want to integrate with a SQL database, so I'm going to click on the plus button over here to be able to choose that element. Now you'll notice that all of the nodes inside Flowgear are categorized under one of these four categories. Connectors integrate with a third-party application or service. Triggers wait for a condition to be met, like a file being created somewhere or an email arriving at an inbox. Processors manipulate data in memory, like our visual data mapper, and evaluators check if a condition has been reached, for example an if statement or a switch or choose statement. So I'll filter for SQL query by just typing in that text, SQL query, and the first one on the left is Microsoft SQL query. So go and add that to the design canvas. And what we've added now is a visual representation of this node. The top section over here is what we call the node header. The section below that lists all of the properties that are specific to this node. So in the case of a SQL connection, I need to be able to provide a connection and then the query that we're going to execute, and then we'll get some results out from executing that query. I'll walk you through some of the basic concepts. First of all, this header is what you can use to move this node around on the design canvas. So if you mouse down and drag, you can relocate it to wherever you like it. Secondly, right now if I hover this, you can see it showing me the default name of this node, which is what appears on screen over here. But it's usually useful to rename that to say, to state the task that it's performing. So if you click it again, you get an editable text box, and I can say query contacts, for example, because I'm going to query the contact table, and then you can just click off or press return to defocus that. So I've now changed the name, and it's a descriptive name that will help me to understand what the point of this step was when I come back to this workflow later. Now over on the right hand side here is the options context menu, and this provides some useful options that we're going to use pretty extensively. Under choose sample, if there are samples available for this particular connector, you'll be able to access them from over there. If you're coming back to a workflow after a period of time, or we've added some new features into a connector, you can upgrade to access the latest version by using these options. We'll get into some of the run options during the certification course, as well as the load recent logs. And finally, you can remove the node from the design canvas or get help for the node straight from here. So this will take you to the help article for this particular connector. Now you'll notice these circles on the left and the right hand sides. These are what we call flow sockets, and they allow you to pass execution or data into or out of the node. So for example, what I want to do is when I run this workflow, I want to start with the start entry, and then I want to run the SQL query node immediately after that. So to do that, I can create an execution flow line, and I'll do that by dragging from this flow socket against the start property and snapping that into Microsoft SQL query on the right. As soon as I do that, it creates that purple line. That's showing Flowgear the sequence of execution. So it's going to start at start and then move across to the query contacts step. Now you'll notice that the properties also have flow sockets, but instead of controlling execution sequence, so in other words the order in which things run, these control how data moves in and out of individual nodes. Now this particular node doesn't need special data coming into it. We're just going to write in a query in a minute, but once we've done that, we'll be able to access the data that came out. So when we executed that query, we'll be able to take the result of that data and perform an action on that in the next step. Alright, so the first thing that we need to do to get this to work for us is to create a connection for this. So preferably if you're running Windows, go ahead and follow along as I do this. Focus the connection property, and on the right hand side are two buttons. Plus will add a new connection for me. Edit will allow me to edit a connection once I have one focused. Now there are two ways to add a connection, either clicking the plus, or I can go across to the connections tab on the left hand side and add it from there. Now, one of the features that we have in Flowgear is almost any link inside Flowgear can be opened in a separate tab. So it's not uncommon to have multiple tabs open simultaneously. So if I wanted to have a look at the Connections tab, I could just middle click on the connection over here, and that would open up in a separate tab. These are my existing connections that I have, and if I wanted to create a new connection over here, I could click plus. So that's one way to do it, but the way that we'll do it for purposes of this example is back on the design, we focus the connection property, click on the plus button to generate a new connection. You'll see at the top of the screen it says connection saved, and it's filled out some connection details for me, or it's filled out a name rather. Now that's just a stub, that's an empty connection, and I need to now configure that so that I can actually do something useful with it. So now click on the edit connection button, and Flowgear will open that stub connection in a new browser tab for me. Now over here you can see a couple of things going on. First of all, we've got the name for this connection, and you can change that to something more friendly. Maybe this is your ERP database or your CRM database, so you might want to have an appropriate name over there. And then down at the bottom are the details that actually tell Flowgear how to get to that connection. The server, database, username, and password are specific to Microsoft SQL. So if you've ever worked with a SQL database, those are the requirements that you'll need to provide. But then in addition to that, we have a drop point option. Now, what happens here is there are two different ways that you can connect to services within Flowgear. You can either connect from cloud, which means that the connection will be established directly from our cloud environment, or you can connect through a software agent that's been installed in the company network. And I recommend doing this for this example. The software agent is what we call a drop point, and you can choose to route any connection through it, which means that you can get access to any approved resource inside a company network, provided that you've got the drop point installed on an appropriate machine with the appropriate level of access. So if you are running Windows, I recommend you follow these steps as well. If you're running Mac, maybe just follow along visually. You won't be able to actually complete this. But I'm going to middle click on the drop points pane. And this is now taking me to a list of the drop points that I have registered. This one at the top is the one that's actually running on my personal laptop, and that's the one that I'll be engaging with. What you will have is a blank screen over here, and you need to click the plus button and choose the 64-bit drop point. What that will give you is a small Windows installer, run through that install process, and then launch the drop point. So in the start menu, there'll be a Flowgear drop point entry. Launch that. The first thing you're prompted with is to sign in with your Flowgear credentials. Sign in, and then in the next screen you'll be able to register that drop point to your Flowgear site. Now your site is what's showing in the top right hand side over here. I'm in the certification training site right now. So go and register against your site, and then come back into the screen, hit the refresh button, and you'll see your drop point show up there. Then from then on you're going to be able to address the connection through that drop point. So if you go back to your connection, if you've kept this open in the meantime, if you drop this down, this might still be an empty list. If that's the case, just refresh your browser page, and that will then pick up the drop point that you've just registered. And now, because I've got that drop point, I can route through to my server like a local machine. So my server name is local. Instead of providing, domainname.com where the SQL server is exposed, I can just provide brackets local like that. I have a database called DemoDB, and I have some credentials against that. So go ahead and do the same thing. Once you've filled that out, hit the play button at the top of the screen to test that that connection is working, and you should get a message, test succeeded. Once you've got that, hit the save button and your connection is good to go. Now we can go back to the first tab, and the last thing that we want to do to get this to execute is just enter in some query details. So it's pre-filled here, select top 10 star from table, but the word table needs to be replaced out with the name of a table that I have. As I drilled into that, it did show me a list of the objects that I have, so I can see I've got a contacts table over here, and that's what I will specify. So select top 10 star from contacts, and then I'll hit the OK button. So we've configured this node now by A, providing a connection, and B, providing some query text. So now we're ready to execute this workflow, and we do that by hitting the play button at the top of the screen. And as we do that, an activity log pops out at the bottom, showing me the different steps that have executed, and I can see the query contacts step. And importantly, when I look at the result data, here's the results property over here. I can drill into that, and I can see 10 contacts that came out by virtue of querying that database. Now, what you're looking at here is a table presentation of that data, but if you click on the Value tab, this is the underlying XML data. Now, some connectors in Flowgear are going to work with XML, some of them are going to be JSON, and some of them are going to support both. So the underlying form of that data is going to change, but usually it'll be visualized for you in this table form where that's possible as well. So we've built a very simple one-step workflow. Now what we're going to do is take that data that we got out and we're going to save it into the file system. And the way that we're going to do that is add a connector called File to the design canvas. So again, on the design canvas, click on the plus button and filter for File, this one over here. And here we can see some different properties available. First of all, I can provide a connection. So I will create a connection that uses my drop point to locate my file system. Then there's an action option. I'll set that to write because I want to create a file. Then there's a path option where I will provide the path to the file that I want to create. For my case, I'm going to do dtemp contacts.xml, for example, and then we've got file data, which I'll come back to in a second. So now what we'll do is establish a connection. Again, to create a new connection, I'll focus the connection property, click on the plus button that generates a stub for me, click on the edit connection button. That will take me to the details of this connection that I've just created, and the only thing I need to do here is to select the drop point that I want and hit save. Note that you can't test this connection because there's nothing to test. All it can check is that it's able to execute at the drop point, but it doesn't know what to check. There's no file to read or write, so there's no test option against this. So if I go back onto the design canvas, I've now configured this to connect to the drop point that we used for the database, so in other words my laptop drop point. I've told it I want to write a file. I've told it that file that it's just going to create is going to be in dtemp contacts.xml. It's a text file, that's the default option, and now I need to provide the content for that file. I'm going to create two types of flows now, data flows and execution flows. So first of all, along the top here I'm going to create an execution flow, and I'll do that by dragging from the output on query contacts, the purple output, into file. This is telling Flowgear run start, then run query, then run file. Then I'm going to also show it how to access the file data that we want to create. So I'll drag out of result XML and plug that into file data. So the data that we received out of this property is getting plugged as an input into the file data property, and that's how we're able to create the file. Now if I have a look at my temp folder, this is how it stands at the moment. It's an empty folder. So let's go ahead and run the workflow and let it execute those two steps. So I can see that they both executed successfully. That's what these ticks are showing me over here. And if I have a look at that folder now, there's the contacts XML file that it just created. So we created a simple but functional integration. Alright, now I'm going to show you how to create a little bit of reusability inside a workflow and some general workflow manipulation tips. So I've established an execution flow connector over here and a data flow connector over here, but sometimes I need to change these. So for either of these connectors, if I needed to move or remove them, you can drag somewhere along the length, not on the flow socket on the left or right extremes, but somewhere along the flow line itself. Mouse down and drag to be able to move the flow connector away. If I release the mouse now, it'll remove that flow connector. So I'll recreate that again. That's how to remove. And if I want to move it to a different place, I can drag and then dock onto a different property. So it's very easy to move these around as necessary. Now, sometimes the elements that you need to connect together are quite far apart on the screen, and it might not be practical to connect across them in a single drag movement. So the way that you can get around that is by single clicking on the output flow socket on the right hand side of the node. Single click, it'll create a docked section over there, and then single click on the target and it'll create a connection there. Now because these lines are really far apart, they're showing with a Wi-Fi icon to show that they're not actually so that the whole line is not being rendered. If I wanted to see where that line goes, I can focus the flow socket and it will show me how that line actually is rendered, but when it's not focused, it's not going to show it. When they get close enough, it'll show a connected line instead. Now the same thing goes for the execution flows at the top. Again, if I drag somewhere along the flow line, I can drag off and release to disconnect. I can click left hand side, click right hand side to establish, and if I had additional steps, I'd be able to drag and dock to another stage if I wanted to change the execution flow process. Now some of the gross manipulation features that we have are covered by these options over here. So I can copy and paste and cut and delete nodes individually or in a group. If I want to remove an individual item, I can click the context menu and click on delete node. That'll remove the query node and the flow lines that are connected up to it. If I want to select multiple items, you can hold control and then just drag a rectangle. It will show you the selected nodes over here, and then these actions are going to apply to those selected nodes. So you can manipulate multiple items at one time if you want to, using that technique. Alright, so we'll do one more manipulation on this, and that is we're going to remove the file node, and now we're going to create a workflow that's actually reusable. And for this exercise, we'll create a workflow that will give us a very basic form where I can ask for a contact by its ID. I can say get me contact number 201, and it'll give me the name of that contact back. Now to do this, we want an end user to be able to interact with this workflow. So we've got to create an ability to pass data into the workflow and an ability to get data out of a workflow. And we'll do that using a special node called the variable bar. I'm going to add that to the design canvas, and I'm going to add two because you'll see cosmetically it just looks a little bit easier. So one on the left and one on the right. This is going to be my input variable bar, and by clicking plus I can add a property onto that variable bar, and I'm going to add a property called ID or contact ID. Now this is going to be an input into the workflow. So while you've got that property add operation focused, click the checkbox on the right hand side over here and then defocus, and you'll see that it's added a flow socket on the right hand side. So here I want to be able to provide a contact ID and get that injected into the query so that we can query for that specific contact. So to do that, I'll add a custom property to the SQL query node by clicking on plus over here, and then also type the name ID, and that's going to be the name of my custom property. Now I can create a data flow line from the ID property on variable bar to the ID property on the SQL query. And let's go and pre-fill in some hard-coded text so that we can check this is going to behave properly. So if I look at my activity logs, I can drill into that, and there is contact 1, so that we know that contact 1 is a valid ID. So I'll go out of the log, and I'm just going to put a 1 into the value for this property. You'll see how, as an end user, I'll be able to change that property in a minute. And then I can compose a query that will actually take cognizance of that ID and filter for that specific contact. So select top 10 star from contacts where ID equals @ID. So what this is saying, if you're not familiar with SQL, is filter the ID field in the contacts table to match the ID custom property that I just added to the SQL query node. Alright, and if I execute that step and we have a look at the activity that came back and I drill into the result, I'll see that only one contact came back now. Alright, now what we want to be able to do is provide some of those specific fields back to the end user. So I'm going to add a couple of properties, one for first name and then one for phone. And then what I can do is take that result data and plug it into both first name and into phone. Now, if you're tracking with me, you'll notice that the result XML is a full XML document. I don't want to plug the entire XML document into first name, I just want the first name. So in Flowgear we have what are called data mapping expressions, where I can say, given a document, pull out this section of that document. To access these, hover the data flow connector and you'll get a formula icon. If you click the formula icon, you'll get a small tree view showing you the different properties that are available. I'm getting an overlay from Google Chrome right now, hopefully you don't get that. But click on the first name property for first name, and then focus the formula icon for phone number, and we'll choose the phone property out of that. Now what Flowgear has actually done here is it's figured out this schema, it's figured out this structure of data by looking at where the Flowgear or the flow connector was connected in, and then it's tried to find some activity logs which it found over here, and it copied a sample of those activity logs into the design canvas. So now in the result XML property I've got some specimen data, and that's what's enabled Flowgear to filter. So first name for the first name and phone for the phone field. So those are the two pieces of data that I've obtained out. So now when I run this workflow from the design view, if I have a look at the start entry, I can see first name filled in over there and then phone filled in over here. So I've created a little reusable workflow that allows me to access bits of contact information in this case. Now the last step that we're going to perform is allow an end user to run this workflow directly. That's not something an end user will be able to do until we explicitly allow it. And the way that I will do that is by going into the workflow settings area. So at the top of the screen, just to the right of the Save button, click the Workflow Settings button. And this middle toggle, Allow Run On Demand, click that to toggle it on. If you're using this light theme, that'll turn purple when it's turned on. And then close this screen, hit the save button, and then go to the workflow landing pane. So you can do that by clicking this button over here. And this takes us directly to what we call the landing screen for the workflow. And the option that I have here is Run Workflow. So if I go into Run Workflow, this is now going to present to me the form that we just designed. So remember, we had an input of ID and output of first name and phone. So let's say I want to query contact number 2. I can plug that in and click Run Workflow, and I've retrieved that contact information back. So these are some basic steps. Familiarize yourself with this, go through these same examples, put together a small database with some specimen data. You don't have to use a table called contacts, but just go through these exact examples. If you're familiar with these, you'll be in a good position for the certification course.